The prison transport shuddered as it broke through the atmosphere of 442B, its hull groaning under the stress of atmospheric entry. Inside the cramped holding cells, dozens of alien prisoners swayed with each violent tremor, their various appendages gripping whatever they could find for stability. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, causing some of the smaller beings to float momentarily before crashing back down. Prester scaled back against the cold metal wall of her cell, her elongated fingers wrapped around the energy bars that kept her trapped. Her people, were known throughout the galaxy for their incredible agility and grace, but here she felt nothing but defeat weighing down her slender frame. Her large, amber eyes reflected the dim emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. The Galactic Enforcement Coalition had finally caught up with her after 3 years of running. 3 years of stealing food to survive, hiding in the shadows of space stations, and avoiding the hunters who wanted to claim the bounty on her head. Her crime had been simple enough. She had refused to hand over her younger brother to the Coalition's military draft when he was barely old enough to hold a weapon. It had been conquered 2 decades ago, and since then, her people had been treated as little more than property. Their natural speed and reflexes made them valuable as scouts and infiltrators for the Coalition's endless wars. Children were taken from their families as soon as they reached adolescence, trained to be soldiers in conflicts they had no stake in, fighting for the very empire that had destroyed their world. Had hidden her brother for months, moving from settlement to settlement, but eventually the Coalition found them. In the chaos of the raid, she had managed to help him escape, but she was captured in the process. She never learned if he made it to safety or if he was eventually caught as well. The uncertainty gnawed at her more than the physical discomfort of her imprisonment. The transport's captain, a bulky with thick gray hide, announced through the intercom that they would be landing shortly at Facility 7, one of the Coalition's most notorious prison colonies. Had heard whispers about this place during her time in the holding cells on the main detention ship. Prisoners sent there rarely came back, and those who did were broken shells of their former selves. As the ship touched down with a bone-jarring impact, closed her eyes and tried to remember her brother's face. His scales had been a brighter blue than hers, and he had their mother's quick smile. She wondered if he was still alive, still free, or if her sacrifice had been meaningless. The cell doors hissed open simultaneously, and Coalition guards in powered armor began herding the prisoners out. Shuffled forward with the rest, her legs weak from months of confinement and poor nutrition. The gravity on this planet was slightly heavier than what she was used to, making each step feel labored and difficult. The first thing that hit her when they exited the transport was the smell, a mixture of industrial chemicals, unwashed bodies, and something else she couldn't identify but made her stomach turn. The second thing was the heat. 442B was a desert world, and even though it was apparently evening local time, the temperature was oppressive. Facility 7 stretched out before them like a metallic cancer on the landscape. Massive walls topped with energy barriers extended as far as the eye could see, dotted with guard towers and defensive emplacements. The main complex consisted of several large buildings connected by covered walkways, all painted in the same dull gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The prisoners were organized into groups based on their species and perceived threat levels. Found herself with a mixed group of about 20 beings, most of whom appeared to be petty criminals or political prisoners like herself. A few looked like hardened criminals, their bodies bearing the scars of violent lives, but even they seemed subdued by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. Their processing began immediately. Each prisoner was scanned and assigned a number that would replace their name for the duration of their sentence. Became prisoner 47,291. The guard who processed her, a thin humanoid with pale skin and dead eyes, barely looked at her as he stamped her file and moved on to the next person in line. The cell blocks were even worse than she had imagined. Each cell was barely large enough for a single being to lie down, with a small toilet unit and water dispenser built into the wall. The walls themselves were made of some kind of composite material that felt cold and slightly damp to the touch, and the air circulation was minimal, leaving the entire block feeling stifling and close. Cell was on the 3rd level of Block C, accessible only by a narrow catwalk that vibrated ominously under foot traffic. Her neighbors were a mixture of species she didn't recognize, all of them looking as defeated and hopeless as she felt. The being in the cell to her left appeared to be some kind of creature with multiple arms and compound eyes, while the one to her right looked vaguely reptilian, but with fur instead of scales. The first night was the worst. The lights never fully turned off, leaving everything in a dim twilight that made it impossible to judge the passage of time. The sounds of the prison never stopped either distant conversations, the hum of machinery, occasional shouts or cries from other parts of the facility. Lay on the narrow metal shelf that served as a bed, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about what the rest of her life would be like in this place. Her sentence was indefinite detention, which meant she would remain here until the Coalition decided she was no longer a threat or until she died, whichever came first. Given that her crime was protecting her family, she doubted they would ever consider her rehabilitated. The food, when it came, was a gray paste that tasted like nothing and had the consistency of wet sand. It provided the minimum nutrition necessary to keep the prisoners alive and working, but nothing more. Forced herself to eat it anyway, knowing she would need her strength for whatever labor they would assign her. Work assignments were handed out on the second day. Was assigned to the mining detail, which meant spending 12 hours a day in the underground tunnels beneath the prison, extracting valuable minerals that would be shipped off-world to fund the Coalition's war machine. The work was, and dangerous, with frequent cave-ins and equipment failures that injured or killed workers regularly. The other prisoners in her work group were a diverse bunch, representing dozens of different species from across the galaxy. Some had been here for decades, their bodies worn down by the harsh labor and poor conditions. Others were newer arrivals like herself, still adjusting to the reality of their situation. Most of them had given up any hope of escape or rescue. The few who still harbored such thoughts were quickly discouraged by the veterans, who explained in graphic detail what happened to prisoners who attempted to flee. The planet's surface was largely uninhabitable desert. The nearest settlement was hundreds of kilometers away, and the Coalition maintained a constant orbital presence to prevent any unauthorized departures. As the days blended into weeks, felt her spirit slowly breaking under the weight of despair. The work was exhausting, the food barely adequate, and the living conditions were designed to crush any sense of dignity or self-worth. She began to understand why so many of the long-term prisoners looked like walking corpses, going through the motions of existence without any real life behind their eyes. The guards were particularly cruel to the newer prisoners, seeming to take pleasure in breaking down their resistance and hope. They would assign the most dangerous tasks to those who still showed signs of defiance, and medical care was from anyone who caused trouble. Learned quickly to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention to herself. But even as she adapted to the harsh routine, she never stopped thinking about her brother. In her darkest moments, lying in her cell listening to the sounds of suffering around her, she would picture his face and remember why she had made the choices that led her here. She told herself that even if she died in this place, at least she had given him a chance at freedom. The other prisoners rarely spoke to each other beyond what was necessary for work. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, as the guards regularly used informants to root out any signs of organized resistance or escape planning. Learned to read the subtle signs of who could be trusted and who might sell information for an extra ration or a lighter work assignment. There was one prisoner who intrigued her, though she was careful not to show it. He was in a cell several levels below hers, and she only saw him during work shifts and meal times. He was obviously from a species she had never encountered before, roughly humanoid in shape, but with pale skin, dark hair, and strange forward-facing eyes. Most species had eyes positioned to give them a wider field of vision, but his were focused straight ahead like a predator's. What made him stand out wasn't his unusual appearance, though. It was the way he carried himself. Despite being in the same hopeless situation as everyone else, he moved with a quiet confidence that suggested he hadn't given up. He was always aware of his surroundings, his head moving slightly as he tracked the movements of guards and other prisoners. When he worked, he was efficient and careful, never drawing attention, but also never showing the defeated posture that characterized most of the long-term inmates. The other prisoners seemed to avoid him, though couldn't tell if it was from fear, suspicion, or something else. The guards watched him more closely than most, but they also seemed to respect him in a way that was unusual. During her third week at the facility, she overheard two guards discussing him in hushed tones, mentioning something about his species being particularly dangerous, and the need to keep him isolated from certain other prisoners. Found herself looking forward to the brief glimpses she caught of this mysterious being during their daily routines. There was something about his presence that reminded her that not everyone had been completely broken by this place. It was a small comfort, but in an environment designed to strip away all hope, even small comforts were precious. The work in the mines grew more dangerous as they pushed deeper into the planet's crust. The equipment was old and poorly maintained, and safety protocols were virtually non-existent. Prisoners who were injured on the job were often left to heal on their own or simply transferred to less demanding work if they were permanently disabled. Those who were killed were quickly replaced by new arrivals, their names erased from the records as if they had never existed. Had several close calls during her first month, including a tunnel collapse that trapped her and 3 other prisoners for several hours before rescue equipment could reach them. One of her companions, an elderly being from a species she didn't recognize, didn't survive the cave-in. His body was removed without ceremony, and his bunk was occupied by a new prisoner the very next day. The psychological toll was almost worse than the physical hardships. The constant fear, the dehumanizing treatment, and the complete lack of privacy or dignity wore away at her sense of self. She began to understand how some prisoners simply stopped eating and allowed themselves to waste away rather than continue enduring the endless cycle of suffering. But whenever she felt herself sliding toward that kind of despair, she would remember her brother's face and force herself to keep going. She had sacrificed everything to give him a chance at freedom, and she wouldn't dishonor that sacrifice by giving up now. Even if she never saw him again, even if she died in this place, she would maintain her dignity and her hope as long as she could. As her second month at Facility 7 began, had settled into the grim routine of prison life. She woke before dawn to the harsh sound of the alarm, dressed quickly in her threadbare work clothes, and joined the long line for morning rations. The gray paste had not gotten any more palatable with time, but she had learned to eat it quickly and without thinking about the taste. The walk to the mine entrance was always conducted in silence, with armed guards flanking the columns of prisoners. The desert landscape beyond the prison walls looked almost beautiful in the early morning light, with red and orange hues painting the distant mountains and casting long shadows across the sand. For a few moments each day, could almost forget where she was and imagine she was simply taking a morning walk on some exotic world. But the illusion never lasted long. As soon as they descended into the tunnels, the oppressive weight of her situation would crash back down on her. The air was thick with dust and chemical fumes, the lighting was poor, and the constant threat of accidents or equipment failure kept everyone on edge. It was during her 8th week at the facility that everything changed. The work shift had been particularly brutal that day, with 2 minor cave-ins and a malfunctioning air recycler that left everyone gasping and coughing. Several prisoners had collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried out by their companions, as the guards showed no inclination to help. Was working in one of the deeper tunnels, using a sonic drill to break apart the rock face so others could extract the valuable ore embedded within. The work required intense concentration, as the drill had to be precisely calibrated to avoid hitting unstable areas that could trigger a collapse. Her hands had long since developed calluses from gripping the heavy tool, and her back ached constantly from hunching over in the low tunnel. She was so focused on her work that she didn't notice the strange rumbling at first. When she did become aware of it, she assumed it was just another minor tremor, the kind that happened several times a day as the mining operations destabilized the underground structure. But this rumbling was different. It seemed to be coming from above rather than below, and it was getting steadily louder. Other prisoners in the tunnel began looking around nervously, their various senses picking up signs of something unusual happening. The guards, who normally paid little attention to anything except preventing escape attempts, were speaking rapidly into their communication devices and looking genuinely concerned. Suddenly, the rumbling became a deafening roar, and the entire tunnel shook violently. Emergency lights began flashing, and the automated warning system began broadcasting evacuation procedures. But before anyone could move, a section of the tunnel ceiling collapsed, blocking the main exit and trapping, and 5 other prisoners in a small chamber. The dust was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few centimeters in any direction. Pressed her back against the wall and tried to breathe shallowly to avoid inhaling too much of the debris. Around her, she could hear the others coughing and calling out to see who was still alive and uninjured. When the dust finally began to settle, could see that the chamber was only about 3 meters square, with barely enough room for the 6 trapped prisoners to move around. The ceiling was partially collapsed, held up by twisted metal support beams that groaned ominously under the weight. Water was beginning to seep through cracks in the walls, suggesting that an underground reservoir had been breached. Among her companions were two beings she recognized from her work group, a stocky creature with thick armor plating, and another with tentacle-like appendages, as well as three she had never spoken to before. And there, sitting calmly against the far wall despite their dire circumstances, was the strange humanoid she had been observing for weeks. Up close, his features were even more unusual than she had realized. His skin was pale but seemed to have an underlying toughness to it, and his dark hair was cut short in a practical style. But it was his eyes that were most striking. They were a deep brown color and seemed to hold an intelligence and awareness that was rare among the broken prisoners of Facility 7. While the others were beginning to panic about their situation, he was methodically examining their surroundings, his gaze moving from the blocked entrance to the unstable ceiling to the water seeping through the walls. He seemed to be calculating something, and his calm demeanor was having a stabilizing effect on the group. One of the other prisoners, a being whose species didn't recognize, was becoming increasingly agitated. It kept making high-pitched keening sounds and clawing at the blocked entrance, trying desperately to dig its way out. The panicked behavior was making the others nervous and using up precious oxygen. The humanoid moved smoothly across the small space and placed a gentle but firm hand on the agitated prisoner's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was calm and reassuring, though he was speaking in a language didn't understand. But somehow, his tone and manner conveyed such confidence and authority that the panicking prisoner gradually calmed down. Then he turned to address the group, switching to the standard galactic trade language that most species could understand. His accent was unfamiliar, but his words were clear and precise. "My name is," he said simply. "I know this situation looks bad, but we're not going to die here. The water seepage means there's a way out through the walls, and the ceiling is more stable than it appears. We just need to work together and stay calm." Found herself staring at him in amazement. Here they were, trapped in what seemed like a hopeless situation, and he was talking as if their rescue was a certainty rather than a desperate hope. She had seen too much defeat and despair in this place to easily believe in miracles, but something about his confidence made her want to trust him. The stocky armored being spoke up, its voice a low rumble that echoed in the small space. "The guards won't come for us. They'll seal off this section and write us off as casualties. We're on our own." Nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "I know, that's why we're going to get ourselves out." Over the next several hours, as water continued to seep into their chamber and the air grew increasingly stale, organized their survival efforts with a competence that seemed impossible under the circumstances. He had them take turns digging at different points along the walls, looking for weak spots that might lead to adjacent tunnels. He rationed the small amount of food they had between them and made sure everyone stayed hydrated with the steadily rising water. But more than his practical skills, it was his attitude that kept the group's spirits up. He spoke to each of them individually, learning their names and something about their backgrounds. He seemed genuinely interested in their stories and treated everyone with a respect that had been absent from their lives for so long that some of them had forgotten what it felt like. When it was turn to talk with him, she found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told him about her brother, about her decision to protect him, and about the guilt she carried over not knowing if her sacrifice had been worthwhile. Listened without judgment, his strange, forward-facing eyes focused intently on her face, as if her words were the most important thing in the universe. "You did the right thing," he said when she finished. "Protecting family is never wrong, no matter what the consequences. Your brother may not know exactly what you sacrificed for him, but he knows he's free because of your love. That knowledge will make him stronger than any military training ever could." His words hit her like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they offered a comfort she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to believe that her suffering might have meaning beyond simple punishment. As the water level in their chamber continued to rise and their air supply dwindled, Never lost his calm demeanor or his confidence that they would find a way out. He kept the group working in shifts, maintaining their strength and morale even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. And somehow, impossibly, his confidence proved to be justified. On their second day of entrapment, one of their digging efforts broke through into an adjacent maintenance tunnel that had been abandoned years ago. The opening was barely large enough for them to squeeze through one at a time, and the tunnel beyond was partially flooded and filled with debris, but it represented a path to freedom. Insisted on going first, disappearing into the narrow opening with nothing but a small piece of metal to use as a tool. For what felt like hours, the rest of them waited in their steadily flooding chamber, listening to the sounds of his progress echoing through the walls. When he finally returned, he was covered in mud and bleeding from numerous cuts, but he was smiling. "There's a way out," he announced. "It's not easy, but we can all make it if we're careful." The escape that followed was harrowing and exhausting, requiring them to crawl through flooded tunnels, climb up unstable debris piles, and squeeze through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow. Several times was certain they would be trapped or crushed, but had mapped out every step of the route and guided each of them through the most dangerous sections. When they finally emerged into one of the main tunnel systems, they were met by a rescue team that had been working frantically to reach them. The guards seemed genuinely surprised to see them alive, and caught several exchanging meaningful looks when they saw that had been the one to lead them out. But their rescue came with an immediate complication. The tunnel collapse had been caused by an explosion in one of the upper levels, and initial investigations suggested it might have been sabotage rather than an accident. Security throughout the facility was being increased, and all prisoners who had been in the affected area were being subjected to enhanced interrogation to determine if any of them had been involved in the incident. As they were escorted back to the surface, realized that their brief taste of hope and cooperation might have made their situation even worse. The guards were clearly suspicious of how they had managed to survive and escape, and in particular was receiving special attention that did not bode well for any of them. But even as she worried about what might happen next, found that something fundamental had changed inside her. For the first time in months, she had been reminded that not all hope was lost, that even in the darkest circumstances, there could be people who refused to give up and who were willing to help others even at great personal risk. The interrogation chambers in Facility 7 were located in the deepest part of the complex, far below the regular cell blocks and work areas. The walls were lined with sound-dampening material that absorbed both noise and hope, creating an atmosphere of suffocating isolation. Each chamber was equipped with restraint systems designed to accommodate dozens of different alien physiologies, along with monitoring equipment that could detect lies across multiple species. Sat strapped to a metal chair that automatically adjusted to her anatomy, the cold metal pressing against her scales in ways that made her skin crawl. Electrodes attached to various parts of her body monitored her vital signs, feeding data to a computer system that analyzed her responses for signs of deception. The bright lights overhead were positioned to create maximum discomfort without causing permanent damage, a carefully calculated form of psychological pressure. Across from her sat Inspector, a tall humanoid with pale gray skin and completely black eyes that reflected no emotion whatsoever. His species, were known throughout the galaxy for their analytical minds and complete lack of empathy, making them ideal for interrogation work. He spoke in a monotone voice that never varied in pitch or intensity, making it impossible to read his mood or intentions. "Prisoner 47,291, he began, consulting his data pad without looking at her. "You were trapped in Sector 7 Delta for approximately 38 hours following the explosion. During that time, you were in the company of 5 other prisoners, including the human designated prisoner 23,847. I want you to tell me everything that happened during your confinement." The word human hit like a physical shock. She had never heard the term before, and something about the way pronounced it suggested it carried significant meaning within coalition intelligence circles. She filed this information away while carefully considering how to respond to his questions. "We were trapped when the ceiling collapsed," she said, keeping her voice as neutral as possible. "The human. He helped organize our survival efforts. We found a way out through an old maintenance tunnel." Inspector made a note on his pad, then looked up at her for the first time. His black eyes seemed to bore into her skull, and she could almost feel him analyzing every micro-expression on her face. "The human took charge of your group immediately following the collapse. This is correct." "He was calm while the rest of us were panicking," admitted. "He seemed to know what to do." "And what exactly did he do?" Recounted the events as accurately as she could, describing how it organized their digging efforts, rationed their supplies, and eventually found the escape route. She was careful not to embellish or speculate about his motivations, sticking to observable facts. Did prisoner 23,847 demonstrate any knowledge or capabilities that seemed unusual for a mining laborer? The question was clearly a trap, but wasn't sure how to answer it safely. Had indeed shown remarkable competence and leadership abilities, but acknowledging that might implicate him in whatever the coalition suspected him of. On the other hand, lying about easily verifiable facts would only make her own situation worse. He seemed to understand structural engineering, she said carefully. He knew which walls were safe to dig through and how to shore up unstable areas. I assumed he had construction experience before his imprisonment. Inspector made another note and could see additional questions scrolling across his data pad. The interrogation continued for several more hours, with him asking increasingly specific questions about his behavior, his interactions with the other prisoners, and any conversations they might have had during their confinement. What became clear as the session progressed was that the coalition knew much more about than they were letting on. His questions revealed that they were particularly interested in any signs of leadership behavior, tactical thinking, or attempts to gather intelligence about the facility. They seemed to view him as a significant security risk rather than just another prisoner. When the interrogation finally ended, was returned to her cell feeling drained and confused. The other prisoners who had been trapped with her were being questioned as well, and she caught glimpses of them being escorted to and from the interrogation chambers. All of them looked as exhausted and bewildered as she felt. Himself had disappeared entirely. His cell in the lower levels was now occupied by someone else, and none of the guards would answer questions about where he had been taken. The other long-term prisoners whispered among themselves about special holding areas for high-value detainees, but nobody seemed to know anything concrete. Over the next few days, found herself constantly thinking about and the brief time they had spent together. His calmness in the face of desperate circumstances had been remarkable, but it was more than that. He had treated everyone in their group with genuine respect and kindness, something that was so rare in Facility 7 that it stood out like a beacon. She began to pay more attention to conversations around her, hoping to learn more about humans and why the coalition seemed to consider them particularly dangerous. What she discovered in fragments of overheard discussions and whispered rumors was both fascinating and troubling. Humans, apparently, were a relatively new addition to the galactic community. Their planet had been contacted by the coalition only a few decades ago, during one of the expansion phases that had also conquered. But unlike most species, humans had not been easily integrated into the coalition's power structure. According to the rumors, humans possessed several traits that made them uniquely problematic for an authoritarian government. They were naturally suspicious of authority, had a tendency to form strong emotional bonds that transcended species barriers, and possessed an almost pathological refusal to abandon hope even in hopeless circumstances. These characteristics made them extremely difficult to control through traditional methods. More concerning for the coalition was their apparent talent for inspiring others. Human prisoners had been involved in several escape attempts and minor uprisings across various coalition facilities, not as leaders, but as catalysts that somehow motivated other species to organize and resist. There were reports of humans who had managed to unite fractious prisoner populations and coordinate complex operations despite having no formal authority or special resources. The coalition's solution had been to keep human prisoners isolated from the general population whenever possible, but there were never enough segregated facilities to hold them all. Had apparently been transferred to Facility 7 specifically, because it was considered secure enough to hold high-risk individuals without requiring special accommodation. As learned more about humans and their reputation within the coalition, she began to understand why her brief interaction with had affected her so profoundly. He hadn't just helped them survive their entrapment. He had demonstrated a way of thinking and acting that was fundamentally different from the defeated acceptance that characterized most long-term prisoners. Work assignments resumed after a week of enhanced security measures, but the atmosphere in the mines had changed significantly. Additional guards were posted throughout the tunnels, surveillance equipment had been upgraded, and prisoner movements were tracked more closely than ever before. The explosion that had caused the tunnel collapse was officially attributed to a gas buildup, but everyone knew the real explanation was more complicated. Found herself assigned to a different work detail, further from the site of the collapse. Her new companions were a mix of species and criminal backgrounds, most of them serving short sentences for minor infractions. They were generally more talkative than her previous group, and she learned a great deal about conditions in other parts of the facility. What she heard was troubling. Several prisoners had simply disappeared over the past few months, transferred to unknown locations without explanation. The official story was that they were being relocated to facilities better suited to their specific needs, but the timing and secrecy suggested something more sinister. Among the missing were a number of individuals who had shown signs of leadership or resistance to coalition authority. They included an engineer who had organized work slowdowns to protest unsafe conditions, a priest who had been conducting informal religious services, and several prisoners who had been involved in sharing resources and information between different cell blocks. The pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look for it. The coalition was systematically removing anyone who might serve as a focal point for organized resistance, and given the special attention had received during the interrogations, was certain he had been transferred to whatever black site facility housed the most dangerous political prisoners. But even as she worried about his fate, she found that his influence on her thinking continued to grow. During their brief time together, he had demonstrated that it was possible to maintain dignity and hope even in the worst circumstances. He had shown her that helping others, even at personal risk, was not just a noble ideal, but a practical necessity for maintaining one's humanity in an inhumane system. Began to apply these lessons to her daily life in small but meaningful ways. She started sharing her food rations with prisoners who were too sick or weak to work full shifts. She offered comfort and encouragement to new arrivals who were struggling to adapt to the harsh conditions. She helped resolve conflicts between prisoners before they escalated to violence that would bring brutal retaliation from the guards. Her actions didn't go unnoticed by either the other prisoners or the facility staff. Among her fellow inmates, she gradually earned a reputation as someone who could be trusted to help without judgment or expectation of reward. Prisoners began coming to her with problems both practical and emotional, and she found herself serving as an informal counselor and mediator. The guards, however, viewed her growing influence with suspicion. She was called in for additional questioning several times, with inspectors trying to determine if she was organizing resistance activities or planning escape attempts. Each time, she was able to honestly deny any illegal activities while carefully avoiding mention of the more subtle forms of mutual aid she was providing. One of her most meaningful connections was with a young prisoner from a species she had never encountered before. The being, who told her his name was barely past adolescence and had been sentenced to 10 years for stealing medical supplies to treat his sick sister. He reminded her strongly of her own brother, and she found herself taking a protective interest in his welfare. Was struggling badly with the physical demands of mining work, his slight frame and unfamiliarity with industrial equipment making him a liability to himself and others. Worse, his obvious vulnerability was making him a target for the more predatory prisoners who sought to exploit anyone they perceived as weak. Began training with during their limited free time, teaching him techniques for conserving energy during long work shifts, and showing him how to handle the mining equipment more efficiently. She also made it clear to the other prisoners in their work detail that he was under her protection, using her growing reputation to shield him from harassment. But it was during one of their training sessions that made a discovery that changed everything. As she was showing how to properly grip a sonic drill, she noticed that his hands were shaking badly. At first, she assumed it was fatigue or nervousness, but when she looked more closely, she realized his entire body was trembling with barely contained emotion. She said gently, "What's wrong?" For a moment he seemed unable to speak, then the words came tumbling out in a rush. "There was a human in my cell block," he whispered, looking around fearfully to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Before you came here, he helped me when the other prisoners were trying to hurt me. He taught me things, how to survive here, how to stay strong. Then one day he was just gone, and nobody would tell me what happened to him." His heart began racing as she realized the implications of what was saying. What was this human's name? Replied, confirming her suspicions. He said his people had a saying, "No one left behind." He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would try to help other prisoners the way he helped me. The conversation revealed that had been at facility 7 much longer than anyone realized, quietly working to improve conditions for his fellow prisoners without drawing official attention to his activities. He had organized informal support networks, shared survival knowledge, and provided emotional support to prisoners who were struggling with despair or suicidal thoughts. More importantly, he had been training others to continue his work if he was removed from the general population. Was not the only prisoner who had received this training, had apparently identified dozens of individuals who showed potential for leadership, and quietly prepared them to take over various aspects of his informal aid network. He said humans have a responsibility to help others who are suffering, explained. He said it wasn't about being heroes or making grand gestures. It was about recognizing that everyone deserves dignity and hope, and doing whatever small things we can to make that possible. Over the following weeks, began to understand the full scope of what had accomplished during his time at Facility 7. Through careful questioning and observation, she identified other prisoners who had been part of his network. Some were obvious, individuals who went out of their way to help newcomers, or who consistently shared resources with those in need. Others were more subtle prisoners who seemed to have better information about guard schedules, who always seemed to know which work areas were safer than others, or who had access to medical supplies that weren't officially available. What emerged was a picture of a sophisticated mutual aid system that had been operating right under the noses of the facility administrators. Prisoners were sharing food, medicine, information, and emotional support through carefully concealed channels that avoided official detection. New arrivals were quietly educated about survival strategies, dangerous guards, and safe places to rest or hide when they were sick or injured. The system was designed to be resilient, with multiple redundant connections and no single point of failure. If one person was transferred or disappeared, others could step in to maintain continuity. Leadership was distributed among many individuals rather than concentrated in a few key figures, making it nearly impossible for the authorities to disrupt through targeted removals. Most importantly, the network was built on principles that made it self-sustaining. Had apparently spent considerable time teaching others not just practical survival skills, but also the philosophical framework that motivated his actions. Prisoners who benefited from the system were encouraged to help others in turn, creating a cycle of mutual aid that continued even when its original architect was removed. As became more involved in these activities, she began to understand why the coalition considered humans so dangerous. It wasn't that they were physically superior to other species, or that they possessed advanced technology. Their threat came from their ability to inspire others to believe in values that were fundamentally incompatible with authoritarian control. Had shown his fellow prisoners that they didn't have to accept defeat just because they had been captured and imprisoned. He had demonstrated that maintaining their humanity was not just possible but necessary, and that helping others was a form of resistance that couldn't be stopped by conventional security measures. The coalition could control their bodies, regulate their movements, and monitor their communications, but they couldn't prevent prisoners from caring about each other or from taking small actions to alleviate suffering. And once prisoners began to see themselves as part of a community rather than isolated individuals, the entire basis of the facility's control system began to erode. Its own transformation was a perfect example of this process. When she had first arrived at Facility 7, she had been focused entirely on her own survival and the guilt she carried over her brother's fate. She had seen other prisoners as potential threats or competitors for limited resources, and had avoided forming connections that might make her vulnerable. But her brief interaction with had shown her a different way of thinking about her situation. Instead of seeing her fellow prisoners as obstacles or dangers, she began to understand them as allies in a shared struggle for dignity and survival. Instead of hoarding her resources and knowledge, she began sharing them freely, discovering that generosity rather than depleted her own strength. The change in her perspective had practical benefits as well as emotional ones. Prisoners who had been helped by the network were more likely to share valuable information about guard schedules, safe work areas, and other survival-related intelligence. They were also more willing to provide assistance during emergencies, creating a safety net that protected everyone involved. But perhaps most importantly, participating in the network gave a sense of purpose that helped her maintain her sanity in an environment designed to break down individual identity. Instead of simply enduring each day in hopes of eventual release, she was actively working to improve conditions for herself and others. Her actions had meaning beyond her own survival, connecting her to something larger than her individual circumstances. 3 months after the tunnel collapse that had first brought her into contact with, received news that changed everything. One of the prisoners in her work detail, a being who had connections throughout the facility's information network, approached her with intelligence that had just arrived through unofficial channels. "There's going to be a mass transfer," he whispered during a brief break in their mining operations. "High-value prisoners are being moved to a new facility. The transport ships are already en route." His heart began racing as she realized what this might mean. If was still alive and being held in the special detention area, he would almost certainly be included in any transfer of high-value prisoners. This might be her only chance to see him again, or at least to learn what had happened to him. But the prisoner wasn't finished with his intelligence report. "The transfer isn't just about moving prisoners," he continued. "Word is that the coalition is planning to shut down some of the older facilities and consolidate operations. Facility 7 might be one of them." The implications were staggering. If the facility was being shut down, all the current prisoners would be transferred to other locations, probably scattered across dozens of different facilities throughout the galaxy. The mutual aid network that had created would be completely disrupted, and years of careful relationship building would be lost. More immediately concerning was the question of what would happen to prisoners who were considered too difficult or expensive to transfer. The coalition had a history of simply eliminating problematic individuals rather than dealing with the logistical challenges of moving them. Anyone who had been identified as a potential leader or troublemaker might simply disappear during the chaos of the shutdown process. That night, as lay in her cell thinking about what she had learned, she realized that she was facing the most important decision of her imprisonment. She could continue to keep her head down and hope for the best, trusting that she would somehow survive whatever transitions were coming. Or she could take action to preserve the network that had built and protect the prisoners who had become her extended family. The decision, when she finally made it, felt inevitable. Had risked everything to help strangers, asking nothing in return except that they try to help others in turn. She had benefited from his sacrifice, and now it was her turn to step forward and take responsibility for protecting what he had built. But as she began to plan her next moves, realized that she was not the same frightened, defeated prisoner who had arrived at facility 7 months earlier. Her interactions with and her participation in his network had transformed her from a victim into a leader, from someone who reacted to circumstances into someone who shaped them. She thought about her brother, somewhere in the galaxy hopefully living free because of the sacrifice she had made. She thought about the young prisoner and the dozens of others who depended on the network for survival and hope. And she thought about, wherever he was, and the trust he had placed in people like her to continue his work. Tomorrow, she would begin reaching out to the other network members to coordinate a response to the coming crisis. They would need to find ways to maintain their connections even if they were separated, develop new communication methods, and identify prisoners who could carry their principles to other facilities. It would be dangerous work, with the very real possibility of discovery and punishment, but for the first time since her capture, felt truly alive and purposeful. She was no longer just surviving her imprisonment. She was fighting back in the most effective way possible by refusing to let the system destroy her capacity to care about others. As she drifted off to sleep, she found herself smiling for the first time in months. Had given her something more valuable than freedom. He had given her a mission that transcended her individual. See, the first signs of the impending shutdown came 3 days after learned about the mass transfer. Work assignments were suddenly reduced, with entire sections of the mine being declared off-limits without explanation. Maintenance crews began removing valuable equipment and shipping it off-world, leaving behind only the basic life support systems necessary to keep the remaining prisoners alive. The guards became noticeably more tense and trigger-happy, clearly aware that desperate prisoners might attempt escape or violence if they believed they had nothing left to lose. Additional security patrols were implemented, and the already limited communication between cell blocks was further restricted through new monitoring protocols. But the Coalition's increased security measures had an unintended consequence. They drove the prisoners to rely more heavily on the informal networks that had established. When official channels became unreliable or dangerous, inmates naturally turned to the underground communication systems that had been operating below the radar for months. found herself at the center of increasingly complex coordination efforts as network members worked to gather intelligence about the shutdown process and develop contingency plans for maintaining connections after dispersal. The skills had taught them careful observation, coded communication, and distributed leadership proved invaluable as they navigated the changing circumstances. Through careful questioning of guards and administrative staff, they learned that Facility 7 was indeed being permanently closed within 6 weeks. Most prisoners would be transferred to other coalition facilities, but the process would not be random. Inmates were being categorized based on security risk, species compatibility, and labor specialization requirements. Low-risk prisoners would be sent to minimum security facilities where conditions were somewhat better, but escape opportunities were virtually non-existent. Medium-risk inmates would go to facilities similar to their current location, while high-risk individuals would disappear into the coalition's most secure installations, places from which no one had ever been known to emerge. The classification process was all ready, though prisoners were not being informed of their assignments until just before transfer. Intelligence gathered by network members revealed that had been tentatively classified as medium risk, primarily due to her interrogation responses following the tunnel collapse. Her association with had marked her as someone requiring closer supervision, but not necessarily maximum security containment. More concerning was the fate of prisoners who had been identified as network participants. Through careful observation and analysis, the coalition security apparatus had detected patterns suggesting organized mutual aid activities, though they apparently didn't understand the full scope or sophistication of the system. Several key network members had already been reclassified as high risk and would likely disappear into the black site facilities. Among those targeted for enhanced detention was Young, whose improvement in work performance and social integration had attracted unwanted attention from the guards. His transformation from a frightened, vulnerable newcomer into a confident, capable prisoner had been too dramatic to escape notice, and investigators had correctly concluded that he must have received significant assistance from other inmates. The news hit like a physical blow, reminded her so much of her own brother that she had developed genuine maternal feelings toward him. The thought of him disappearing into a maximum security facility, cut off from the support network that had made his survival possible, filled her with a fury that surprised her with its intensity. But anger, she realized, was exactly what would have warned her against. Emotional reactions led to poor decisions, and poor decisions got people killed or worse. She needed to think strategically about how to protect and the other network members who had been compromised. The solution, when it came to her, was both elegant and terrifying. The coalition's classification system was based on perceived risk levels, but those assessments could be manipulated by prisoners who understood how the system worked. If certain individuals appeared to become less dangerous or influential, they might be reclassified downward. Conversely, if someone else appeared to take on a leadership role, they might draw attention away from the real network organizers. What was contemplating was essentially offering herself as a sacrifice to protect others. If she could convince the authorities that she was the primary organizer of the mutual aid activities, other network members might escape the enhanced scrutiny that was threatening to destroy everything had built. The plan required careful orchestration. She would need to leave evidence of leadership activities that investigators could discover, while making sure that evidence didn't implicate anyone else. She would have to behave in ways that suggested she was coordinating resistance activities without actually endangering the real network operations. Most importantly, she would need to do all of this without consulting the other network members. If they knew what she was planning, they would try to stop her, and their attempts to protect her would only confirm the coalition's suspicions about organized resistance activities. Over the next week, began implementing her deception strategy with the same careful attention to detail that had brought to his network building. She started spending more visible time with known troublemakers, creating the appearance of forming alliances with potential resistance leaders. She began asking guards questions that suggested she was gathering intelligence about facility operations and security procedures. Most effectively, she started openly helping other prisoners in ways that were technically against regulations, but not serious enough to warrant immediate punishment. She shared food openly rather than discreetly, organized informal educational sessions that pushed the boundaries of acceptable group activities. and began mediating disputes in ways that demonstrated clear leadership capabilities. The guards noticed her changed behavior almost immediately, and she could see increased surveillance focusing on her activities. Additional monitoring equipment was installed near her cell, and she was called in for supplementary questioning sessions designed to determine if she was planning something specific. During these interrogations, walked a careful line between appearing suspicious enough to draw attention while not providing evidence of actual illegal activities. She answered questions truthfully, but incompletely, leaving gaps that investigators could fill with their own assumptions about her motivations and capabilities. The strategy worked better than she had dared hope. Within 2 weeks, her security classification had been upgraded to high risk, while several other network members were simultaneously downgraded to medium or low-risk categories. The coalition's attention was focusing on her as a potential resistance leader, while the real organizers continued their work under reduced scrutiny. But success came with a terrible price. Her reclassification meant she would be transferred to a maximum security facility, probably one of the notorious black sites where political prisoners disappeared forever. She would never see her brother again, never learn if her original sacrifice had been worthwhile, and never have a chance to build the kind of life had inspired her to believe was possible. The night before the first wave of transfers was scheduled to begin, lay in her cell thinking about the choices that had brought her to this point. Every major decision in her life had involved protecting someone else at the cost of her own freedom or safety. First her brother, then her fellow prisoners, and now the network that had built to provide hope and dignity in a hopeless place. She thought about himself, wondering where he was and whether he was still alive. The intelligence network had never been able to determine his exact location, though there were rumors that high-value human prisoners were being held at a secret facility somewhere in the Outer Rim territories. If she was lucky, perhaps she would be sent to the same location and would have a chance to see him again. But even if that reunion never happened, she took comfort in knowing that his influence would continue to spread throughout the galaxy. Every prisoner who had been helped by the network would carry those values and techniques to their next facility, potentially seeding new mutual aid systems wherever they ended up. The Coalition's attempt to contain the threat by dispersing prisoners might actually accelerate the spread of resistance activities. The morning of the transfer brought chaos throughout Facility 7. Prisoners were awakened before dawn and herded into processing areas where they were searched, and assigned to specific transport ships based on their security classifications. The low-risk inmates were loaded onto converted cargo haulers with minimal security, while medium-risk prisoners were placed in purpose-built detention transports with moderate guard contingents. And the other high-risk prisoners were reserved for last, and their transport was unlike anything she had ever seen. The ship was essentially a flying prison, with individual cells built into its hull and enough weaponry to destroy a small fleet. Armed guards outnumbered prisoners 2-to-1, and every system was redundantly monitored to prevent escape or sabotage attempts. As she was escorted aboard the ship in heavy restraints, caught sight of other network members being loaded onto different transports, was among the medium-risk prisoners, looking frightened but unbroken as he was guided toward one of the civilian cargo haulers. Several other familiar faces were scattered across the various ships, all of them bound for different destinations throughout Coalition space. But mixed in with her fellow high-risk prisoners were faces she hadn't expected to see. Several individuals who had never been part of the network, including some genuinely dangerous criminals, were being transferred alongside political prisoners and resistance organizers. The Coalition was apparently taking the opportunity to relocate all of their most problematic inmates simultaneously. The journey to their destination took 6 days, during which time was confined to a cell barely large enough to stand up in. Food was delivered through a slot in the door, and exercise periods consisted of 30 minutes per day in a small chamber connected to her cell. Communication with other prisoners was impossible, as each cell was individually soundproofed and monitored. But even in isolation, found ways to maintain connections with the network principals had taught her. She observed the guards' routines carefully, memorizing shift changes and behavioral patterns that might be useful information later. She maintained her physical fitness as much as possible within the cramped confines, preparing her body for whatever challenges lay ahead. Most importantly, she used the long hours of solitude to think through everything had taught her about leadership, resistance, and the importance of maintaining hope in hopeless circumstances. She reviewed conversations they had shared during their brief time together, analyzing his words for deeper meanings and practical applications. One thing that became clear during this reflection was that he had been preparing for exactly this kind of dispersal event. Many of his teachings had focused not on maintaining a single organization, but on developing transferable skills and principles that could be applied in any situation. He had been training network members to be seeds that could grow new resistance movements wherever they were planted. The realization gave a new sense of purpose as their transport finally approached its destination. She wasn't being sent into exile or permanent captivity. She was being deployed to a new mission field where her skills and knowledge could help other prisoners who hadn't yet learned that dignity and hope could survive even the worst circumstances. The facility they were taken to was unlike anything had experienced before. Located on a small moon orbiting a gas giant, it was completely isolated from any civilian populations or commercial activities. The entire installation was built into the moon's surface, with only a few surface structures visible from orbit. Security was absolute and overwhelming. Multiple redundant containment systems ensured that no prisoner could move anywhere without authorization and escort. The guards were all specially trained specialists, and automated systems monitored every aspect of the facility's operations. Escape was not just improbable, it was literally impossible. But had not come here to escape, she had come to plant seeds. The intake process took several days and was more thorough than anything she had experienced at Facility 7. Every aspect of her background, psychology, and behavior patterns was analyzed and documented. She was subjected to multiple interrogation sessions designed to determine her exact role in the resistance activities the Coalition had detected. During these sessions, she continued her carefully calibrated performance as a resistance leader, taking responsibility for network activities while revealing as little as possible about actual methods and participants. She portrayed herself as someone who had been inspired by to organize mutual aid efforts, but who lacked his sophistication and strategic thinking. The performance served multiple purposes. It reinforced the Coalition's belief that they had identified and contained the primary threat, reducing the likelihood that they would continue investigating network activities at other facilities. It also established her credentials with fellow prisoners who might be looking for leadership in this new environment. But most importantly, it gave her access to information about the facility's prisoner population and security procedures. As someone classified as a major security threat, she was subjected to extensive briefings about the rules and consequences governing life in the installation. These briefings inadvertently revealed details about the facility's operations that could be useful for planning resistance activities. What she learned was both encouraging and troubling. The facility housed approximately 300 prisoners, representing dozens of different species and criminal classifications. Many were political prisoners like herself, individuals who had been caught organizing resistance activities or who posed ideological threats to Coalition authority. But there were also genuine criminals, individuals whose violent or destructive behaviors had made them unsuitable for regular detention facilities. The mix created a complex social dynamic where ideological resistance leaders had to coexist with beings who might betray them for personal advantage or simply attack them out of boredom or malice. The physical layout of the facility was designed to prevent large-scale organization while still allowing limited social interaction. Prisoners were housed in small clusters of 6 to 8 individuals, with each cluster isolated from the others except during work periods and meals. Guard rotations ensured that no single cluster could develop long-term relationships with specific staff members. Work assignments were designed to be psychologically grinding rather than physically dangerous. Prisoners spent their days performing repetitive manufacturing tasks that required concentration, but provided no sense of accomplishment or progress. The work was meaningless by design, intended to break down prisoners' sense of purpose and self-worth. But as was processed into the facility's general population, she began to see opportunities that the designers had overlooked. The very isolation that was meant to prevent organization could also provide cover for careful resistance activities. The meaningless work assignments brought prisoners from different clusters into contact during shift changes and break periods. and the facility's sophisticated monitoring systems created predictable blind spots that could be exploited by prisoners who understood their patterns. Most importantly, she recognized that many of her fellow inmates were exactly the kind of people had sought to help at Facility 7. They were defeated, hopeless individuals who had given up on the possibility of maintaining dignity or purpose under their circumstances. They were fertile ground for the seeds of resistance philosophy that she carried. Her cellmates in Cluster 7C were a diverse group representing 5 different species and a range of criminal backgrounds. 2 were political prisoners like herself, a scientist who had been caught sharing classified research and an artist whose work had been deemed subversive by coalition censors. The others were criminals of various types, including a smuggler, a data thief, and someone whose exact crimes remained unclear. The social dynamics within the cluster were tense and suspicious, with each individual focused primarily on personal survival and advancement. Trust was minimal, cooperation was limited to what was absolutely necessary, and mutual aid was virtually non-existent. It was exactly the kind of environment that had specialized in transforming. Began her work slowly and carefully, using techniques she had learned from observing methods. She started by simply being helpful in small ways, sharing information about work procedures, offering assistance with difficult tasks, and providing emotional support to cluster members who were struggling with despair or anxiety. Her actions were initially met with suspicion and skepticism. Several cluster members assumed she was working as an informant for the guards or attempting to manipulate them for personal advantage. Others simply couldn't understand why anyone would offer help without expecting something in return, but persisted with the same patient determination that had demonstrated. She continued offering assistance without asking for reciprocation, provided support without judgment, and gradually demonstrated through her actions that her motivations were genuine. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere within Cluster 7C began to change. The first breakthrough came when one of her cellmates, the scientist named Dr. Vex, became seriously ill during their 3rd week together. The facility's medical care was minimal, designed to keep prisoners alive but not necessarily healthy or comfortable. Dr. Vex was provided with basic medication, but no additional support during his recovery period. Organized the other cluster members to provide care and assistance that the facility would not. They took turns monitoring his condition, shared their food rations to ensure he received adequate nutrition, and covered his work assignments to prevent him from being punished for poor performance while he was sick. The collaborative care effort required the cluster members to work together in ways they had never attempted before. They had to coordinate schedules, share resources, and trust each other with responsibilities that could have serious consequences if mishandled. By the time Dr. Vex had recovered, they had inadvertently formed the kind of mutual aid network that had been building at Facility 7. But's real test came when one of her cellmates, the data thief known only as Cypher, was caught attempting to steal information from the facility's computer systems. The discovery resulted in severe punishment, including extended isolation and reduced rations, penalties that would likely cause permanent health damage if they continued for more than a few weeks. The other cluster members' first instinct was to distance themselves from Cypher to avoid guilt by association. This was standard prisoner behavior, and the guards clearly expected it to happen automatically. What they didn't expect was for the cluster to organize a coordinated response to support their punished member. Led the effort to share their own rations with Cypher during his isolation period, smuggling food to him through carefully coordinated transfers during work shifts. They also took over his work assignments to prevent additional punishment and provided emotional support through coded messages that slipped past the monitoring systems. The campaign required sophisticated planning and coordination that pushed the boundaries of what the facility's security systems could detect. But it also demonstrated to the cluster members that they were capable of much more than simple individual survival. They could protect each other, resist the facility's attempts to break them down, and maintain their dignity even under the most oppressive circumstances. Word of their activities began to spread to other clusters, carried by prisoners who witnessed their coordination during work periods and meals. The guards noticed the increased cooperation, but couldn't determine how it was being organized or prevented. Their investigations revealed no obvious leadership structure or communication network, because had learned from to build systems that were resilient and distributed. Within 2 months of her arrival at the facility, had helped establish informal mutual aid networks in more than half of the prisoner clusters. The networks operated independently, but shared common principles and techniques, creating a facility-wide culture of cooperation that was completely contrary to what the designers had intended. The transformation was subtle but profound. Prisoner injuries decreased because clusters were sharing safety information and watching out for each other during dangerous work operations. Conflicts between inmates became less frequent because mediators had emerged who could resolve disputes before they escalated to violence. And most importantly, the suicide rate dropped to nearly zero as prisoners found renewed purpose in helping and protecting their fellow inmates. But as watched the network spread and mature, she found herself thinking constantly about and wondering if he could see what his teachings had accomplished. She had become the leader she never thought she could be, but it was a leadership built entirely on principles he had taught her during their brief time together. She thought about her brother, free somewhere in the galaxy because of her original sacrifice. She thought about, and the other network members from Facility 7, hopefully establishing similar systems at their new locations. And she thought about the hundreds of other prisoners throughout Coalition space who were discovering that dignity and hope could survive even the darkest circumstances. Had been right about humans, she realized. They did possess something unique and dangerous from the Coalition's perspective. Not superior strength or intelligence, but an ability to inspire others to believe in values that transcended individual survival. It was a gift that could spread like a virus through any population, transforming victims into leaders and despair into determination. The change in Facility Omega-7 was impossible to hide forever. 6 months after its arrival, the transformation in prisoner behavior had become so pronounced that even the most oblivious administrators couldn't ignore it. Work efficiency had improved dramatically, violent incidents had decreased to almost nothing, and the facility was operating more smoothly than it ever had in its operational history. But instead of celebrating these improvements, the Coalition command structure became increasingly paranoid about what they saw as a systematic breakdown of the authority structure they had worked so hard to establish. Prisoners were supposed to be broken, defeated, and focused entirely on individual survival. The cooperation and mutual support that now characterized the facility represented a fundamental threat to the entire detention system. A special investigation team was dispatched from Coalition headquarters to determine how the situation had developed and what could be done to reverse it. The team was led by Director, a ruthless administrator whose previous assignments had included suppressing prisoner uprisings on 3 different worlds. Director arrived with a team of specialists including behavioral analysts, interrogation experts, and tactical response units prepared to use force if necessary to restore proper order. Their first step was to conduct comprehensive interviews with all facility staff to determine how the changes in prisoner behavior had escaped official notice for so long. What they discovered was that the guards themselves had been subtly influenced by the changed atmosphere. Prisoners who treated each other with respect and dignity were easier to manage than those who were constantly fighting or attempting suicide. Work details that cooperated effectively required less supervision and produced better results. Medical emergencies were rare because prisoners were taking care of each other's health and safety. The guards had allowed these improvements to continue not because they supported prisoner welfare, but because they made their own jobs easier and safer. They had been seduced by competence and cooperation without recognizing that these qualities represented a form of resistance to the facility's fundamental purpose. Director's response was swift and brutal. The investigation team implemented immediate changes designed to disrupt the prisoner networks and restore the intended atmosphere of suspicion and desperation. Cluster assignments were randomized weekly to prevent long-term relationship building. Work schedules were altered randomly to make coordination impossible. Food rations were reduced and distributed unequally to encourage competition rather than sharing. But the most devastating change was the introduction of informant incentives. Prisoners who provided information about mutual aid activities or network coordination were rewarded with better food, improved living conditions, and reduced sentences. The policy was designed to destroy trust between inmates and return them to the isolated, self-focused behavior that had characterized the facility before its arrival. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Within days of the new policies being implemented, the carefully built networks began to collapse under the weight of suspicion and betrayal. Prisoners who had been cooperating for months suddenly turned on each other, desperate to claim the rewards that were being offered for information. Watched the destruction of everything she had helped build with a mixture of heartbreak and fascination. The speed with which trust could be destroyed was remarkable, and it demonstrated just how fragile the foundation of their mutual aid system had really been. Had warned her about this possibility, but experiencing it firsthand was far more devastating than she had imagined. But even as the networks crumbled around her, began to notice something else happening. The prisoners who had been most deeply involved in the mutual aid activities were not simply reverting to their previous behavior. Instead, they were adapting to the new circumstances by developing more sophisticated and covert forms of resistance. Instead of open cooperation, they began using subtle signals and coded communications that were much harder for the authorities to detect. Instead of large-scale resource sharing, they developed micro-networks of 2 or 3 individuals who could trust each other completely. Instead of obvious leadership structures, they created distributed decision-making processes that had no single points of failure. The investigation team's attempts to destroy the networks were inadvertently teaching the prisoners to be better at resistance activities. Each new security measure forced them to develop more creative and resilient methods of organization. Each betrayal taught them to be more careful about who they trusted and how they shared sensitive information. Found herself at the center of this evolution, as other prisoners looked to her for guidance about how to adapt to the changing circumstances. Her reputation as someone who had organized resistance activities at her previous facility made her a natural leader, but she was careful to avoid the mistakes that had led to her detection at Facility 7. Instead of taking direct leadership roles, she focused on teaching others the principles had shared with her. She helped them understand that resistance wasn't about dramatic gestures or violent confrontations, but about maintaining their humanity and dignity despite the system's attempts to destroy both. The key insight that had shared with her was that the coalition's power ultimately depended on breaking down prisoners' sense of self-worth and community. If individuals could maintain their values and continue caring about each other, they remained human beings rather than becoming the broken tools the system needed them to be. This understanding transformed how the prisoners approached their resistance activities. Instead of trying to escape or overthrow their captors, they focused on preserving their essential humanity under impossible circumstances. They helped each other maintain physical health, emotional stability, and moral integrity despite constant pressure to abandon all three. The new approach was much more difficult for the authorities to detect or counter, because it operated entirely within the psychological and spiritual realm rather than through observable actions. Prisoners could provide mutual support through nothing more than eye contact and facial expressions. They could share strength and hope through subtle gestures that carried no obvious meaning to outside observers. But even as she helped develop these more sophisticated resistance techniques, never lost sight of the fact that she was implementing strategies that had taught her during their brief time together. His influence continued to spread and evolve, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The investigation team spent 3 months attempting to identify and eliminate the remaining resistance networks. They conducted hundreds of interrogations, implemented dozens of new security measures, and offered increasingly generous rewards for information about illegal activities. But the more they investigated, the more elusive their targets became. Director's frustration was obvious to everyone in the facility. He had built his career on breaking resistance movements and restoring order to chaotic situations, but the networks at Facility Omega-7 seemed to regenerate faster than he could destroy them. Every time he eliminated one group of organizers, new leaders emerged to take their place. Part of the problem was that the investigation team was looking for the wrong kind of organization. They expected to find hierarchical command structures with identifiable leaders giving orders to subordinate followers. What they found instead was a distributed system where leadership emerged organically from shared principles rather than formal authority. But the deeper problem was that they were fighting an idea rather than an organization. Teachings about the importance of maintaining dignity and mutual support weren't dependent on any particular structure or set of individuals. They were philosophical principles that could be adopted by anyone who chose to embrace them. The investigation reached its climax when Director decided to focus his attention on personally. Intelligence from her previous facility had identified her as a key figure in resistance activities, and behavioral analysis suggested she was playing a similar role at Omega 7. If he could break her or eliminate her influence, he believed the entire network would collapse. The interrogation sessions that followed were unlike anything had experienced before. Director was not interested in gathering information about specific activities or identifying other network members. His goal was to break down her psychological defenses and force her to renounce the principles that motivated her resistance activities. The sessions lasted for hours each day, combining sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure techniques designed to destroy her sense of self-worth and purpose. Director was an expert at finding and exploiting personal vulnerabilities, and he focused particularly on her guilt about her brother's fate and her responsibility for other prisoners' suffering. "Your resistance has made things worse for everyone," he told her during one particularly intense session. "The prisoners who followed your example are being punished more severely because of your influence. Your brother is probably dead by now, killed by the very freedom fighters you thought you were helping him join. Everything you've sacrificed for has been meaningless." The accusations were designed to destroy her motivation by convincing her that her actions had been counterproductive. If she could be made to believe that resistance only led to greater suffering, she might abandon her activities and encourage others to do the same. But had learned too much from to be broken by psychological manipulation. During their conversations in the collapsed tunnel, he had prepared her for exactly this kind of attack by helping her understand the deeper purpose behind resistance activities. "The system wants us to believe that helping others is futile," she remembered him saying. "They want us to think that dignity and hope are luxuries we can't afford under our circumstances. But the truth is that maintaining our humanity is the only victory that really matters. If we can continue to care about each other and treat each other with respect, we've already won the only battle that counts." Armed with this understanding, was able to withstand Director's psychological attacks by focusing on what she had accomplished rather than what she had lost. The networks at Facility 7. And now that gift was spreading far beyond the human species, carried by prisoners who had learned that another way was possible, and who were committed to sharing that knowledge with anyone willing to listen and connected her to the best aspects of what it meant to be truly alive. Had saved all their lives, but more than that, he had given her something she thought she had lost forever. He had reminded her that dignity and courage could survive even in a place designed to crush both. Whatever happened next, she would carry that knowledge with her, and it would make her stronger than she had been before their paths crossed in that collapsed tunnel.